anticipating. Here comes Suzuki. Suzuki waits. Oh, what a goal! Ça va bien, Montreal!
Nick Suzuki was never supposed to be this player. He wasn't supposed to be the captain of one of the NHL's most iconic franchises at just 23 years old. He wasn't supposed to carry the weight of a rebuild on his shoulders, and he definitely wasn't supposed to turn one of the league's most ridiculed contracts into one of its biggest bargains. When Montreal traded for him in the Max Pacioretty deal, he was seen as a nice piece, not a franchise cornerstone. When the Canadiens handed him the captaincy, critics laughed, calling him too quiet, too young, too average to lead. When he signed his 8-year extension, analysts branded it one of the league's worst contracts. But here we are today. Nick Suzuki is producing like a legitimate #1 center, anchoring a rebuilding Canadiens roster, and finding himself ranked among the top 10 centers in the league. And yet, outside of Montreal, he still doesn't generate the same buzz as names like Jack Eichel, Aleksander Barkov, or Dylan Larkin. So that leads to the big question: is Nick Suzuki still one of the NHL's most underrated centers? To answer that, we need to revisit his path. The doubts, the contract debate, his rise as captain, and how he stacks up against the league's best. Suzuki's NHL story begins with a trade that, at the time, didn't look like it would define two franchises. Drafted 13th overall by the Vegas Golden Knights in 2017, Suzuki never played a game for them. Instead, he was dealt to Montreal in the blockbuster that sent Max Pacioretty to Vegas. At first glance, Suzuki was the prospect sweetener, a promising forward with a solid junior resume, but not someone expected to carry a franchise. Montreal fans hoped he'd be good, maybe even a top 6 center, but few imagined he'd become their heartbeat. But then, things shifted. Montreal didn't just view him as a prospect, they saw something deeper: composure, hockey IQ, leadership. And before he had even hit his prime, they made the bold decision to put the C on his chest. At just 23, Nick Suzuki became the youngest captain in Canadiens history. The reaction? Brutal. Across the league, pundits scoffed. He's not a true #1 center. Too small, not explosive enough, not dynamic enough to carry a team. In Montreal, a market famous for tearing apart its stars, the pressure multiplied. Suzuki was being judged not only against his peers, but against the ghosts of Canadiens history. When you wear the C in Montreal, you're automatically compared to John Béliveau, Saku Koivu, and Shea Weber. Suzuki hadn't even hit 24 years old, and yet he was expected to lead a franchise that hadn't won a Stanley Cup since 1993. Therefore, every mistake was magnified. Every game where he didn't dominate was framed as evidence that he was more of a 2C, a support player, not a franchise centerpiece. But here's the thing: instead of crumbling under the spotlight, Suzuki thrived in it. Then came the contract. In October 2021, the Canadiens signed Suzuki to an 8-year extension worth $63 million. At the time, the Canadiens were coming off a Cinderella run to the Stanley Cup final, but many saw this as a reckless gamble for a player who had only shown flashes of being a top-line center. Overpaid. One of the worst contracts in the NHL. Those were the headlines. Suzuki had promise, but he wasn't yet a point-per-game player, and many critics argued he'd never justify close to $8 million annually. To them, Montreal was betting their future cap space on someone who might not even be a true #1 center. But then, the rest of the league kept spending. Contracts ballooned. Players like Bo Horvat signed for $8.5 million, Dylan Larkin for $8.7 million, Matt Barzal for over $9 million, and Elias Pettersson eventually inked one north of $11 million. Suddenly, Suzuki's $7.875 million cap hit didn't look like an anchor. It looked like a bargain, especially because he was locked in through his entire prime, while many of his peers will need new deals just as the cap continues to rise. Therefore, the narrative shifted. What was once "the Canadiens made a mistake" became "Montreal might have locked in their captain at a discount for years." Instead of handcuffing the team, Suzuki's deal is now viewed as one of the smartest bets the Canadiens have made in decades. Proof that sometimes patience and long-term vision can flip an entire storyline on its head. But it wasn't just about the numbers. Montreal needed stability. After years of chaos, endless coaching changes, and disappointing seasons, they needed someone steady to represent the franchise. And that's exactly what Suzuki became. As captain, he embraced the role with quiet confidence. He wasn't loud, he wasn't flashy, but he led by example. Teammates praised his maturity, pointing out that even at 23, he carried himself like a veteran. Coaches leaned on him in every situation, whether it was on the power play, killing penalties, or taking the most important face-offs in the final minutes of close games. Therefore, Suzuki became more than just a player. He became the face of the Canadiens' rebuild, the steady presence in a locker room filled with young players trying to find their way. Veterans spoke about how his calm demeanor helped settle things during tough stretches, while younger teammates looked to him as proof that you could block out the noise and still deliver every night. And in Montreal, a market that can eat players alive, that kind of stability is priceless. Few athletes can carry the weight of the jersey, the constant media scrutiny, and the expectations of a passionate fan base without faltering. Suzuki not only handled it, he thrived in it, proving that leadership isn't always about being the loudest voice in the room, but the most consistent presence on and off the ice. Of course, leadership only goes so far if the numbers don't back it up, but Suzuki's play has more than justified the trust placed in him. Without superstar line mates, he still produced consistently in the 70-point range, with the potential for more as the Canadiens improve. He plays tough minutes, faces other teams' top lines, and still drives offense. He's also strong defensively, trusted in late-game situations, and used heavily on both special teams. But then, because Montreal hasn't been a contender, his production gets overlooked. Around the league, fans and media pay attention to who wins, and since Montreal has been rebuilding, Suzuki's consistency doesn't generate the same headlines as someone putting up numbers on a playoff team. Therefore, he remains a quiet producer, highly effective but not always recognized outside of those who watch him closely. When you stack him against other centers, the story gets even clearer. Bo Horvat? Suzuki's numbers are right there, and he's younger, cheaper, and carries a heavier defensive load. Dylan Larkin, similar point totals, but Suzuki has done it with weaker support around him. Without the luxury of wingers like Alex DeBrincat or consistent playoff caliber rosters. Elias Lindholm, Suzuki is more durable, more consistent, and again, locked in on a better contract that won't need to be renegotiated in just a couple of seasons. But then look even higher. Compared to Jack Eichel, Aleksander Barkov, or Sebastian Aho, Suzuki doesn't quite have the same highlight reel plays or playoff resume yet. However, the gap in perception is often bigger than the gap in actual performance. Night after night, Suzuki drives his team with the same reliability, often in tougher circumstances given Montreal's weaker supporting cast. Therefore, by any reasonable comparison, Suzuki belongs in the conversation for top 10 centers in the NHL. He's not at the McDavid, McKinnon, or Matthews level. Few are. But he's firmly in that next tier where players combine offense, defense, leadership, and consistency. And the kicker is this: unlike many of those names, Suzuki is on one of the most team-friendly deals in the league. And yet, despite all of this, his name is rarely mentioned in those debates. That gap between performance and recognition is exactly what makes this conversation so fascinating. Because Suzuki has already proven he deserves to be in that tier, but the hockey world hasn't fully caught on. So why is Suzuki still underrated? First, market bias. Montreal has been struggling, and when a team sits near the bottom of the standings, national attention gravitates elsewhere. Players on winning teams get more hype, even if their numbers aren't better. It's why someone like Mika Zibanejad in New York or Roop Hintz in Dallas gets more spotlight, even though Suzuki stacks up against them statistically. The market matters, and right now, Montreal is still in the middle of a rebuild. Second, his style. Suzuki isn't flashy. He doesn't have Connor McDavid's speed, Nathan McKinnon's explosiveness, or Austin Matthews' jaw-dropping shot. Instead, he thrives on subtlety. The small plays, the quick reads, the perfectly timed passes. Coaches see it, analytics back it up, but casual fans don't always notice the brilliance of a smart defensive stick or a perfectly executed transition. In a highlight-driven league, that kind of intelligence doesn't trend on social media. Third, his personality. Suzuki is calm, reserved, and not the type to chase headlines. He rarely makes bold statements or stirs up controversy. In fact, part of his appeal is how quietly he goes about his business. But that same trait also means fewer viral moments to capture the wider hockey world's attention. Compare him to someone like Brady Tkachuk, who dominates storylines with his physical presence and outspoken style. Suzuki is the opposite, efficient, steady, and understated. Therefore, he continues to fly under the radar. He's elite, but he doesn't feel like a star in the traditional sense because his greatness is rooted in consistency, not spectacle. He does everything you want from a #1 center, plays in all situations, produces offensively, carries defensive responsibilities, leads the locker room, yet he still doesn't receive the same level of hype as others with similar resumes. And that's exactly why he may still be one of the most underrated players in the game today. Not because people doubt him anymore, but because they haven't fully adjusted their perception to match just how much he actually does. But things are shifting. Analysts who once doubted him now praise his two-way game. The contract that was mocked as an overpay is now applauded as a steal. The captaincy that was questioned is now seen as a symbol of stability and foresight from the Canadiens management. In just a few short years, the perception of Nick Suzuki has done a complete 180. Consider this, in 2021, some lists placed him outside the top 30 centers in the league. Today, he's consistently appearing in top 10 discussions. Broadcasters highlight his hockey IQ, advanced metrics showcase his impact, and even opposing coaches admit that shutting down Suzuki is one of the keys to beating Montreal. Slowly but surely, the league is starting to catch on, but then the recognition still lags behind the reality. He doesn't have the same name value as some of his peers, which means casual fans might not rank him where he belongs. His production is elite considering his situation, but because Montreal isn't yet a playoff contender, his work doesn't get the same spotlight as someone putting up numbers on a contender like Colorado or Florida. Therefore, Suzuki's story is one of evolution. From a doubted prospect to an overpaid captain to a quietly elite center who's forcing the hockey world to rethink him. His journey shows how fast narratives can flip in the NHL, but also how long it takes for perception to catch up to reality. And yet, even as the recognition grows, the central question remains, has Nick Suzuki finally earned the respect he deserves? Or is he still flying under the radar compared to his peers? The answer to that question is what makes his story so compelling. So, is Nick Suzuki still the NHL's most underrated center? The answer is yes, because while insiders and hardcore fans are starting to realize how valuable he is, the broader hockey world hasn't caught up yet. He's leading a storied franchise through a rebuild, producing at a top 10 level, anchoring one of the best contracts in the league, and doing it all without the recognition that players in bigger markets or on playoff teams receive. Therefore, as the Canadiens grow and Suzuki enters his prime, the league may finally wake up to just how good he is. But for now, he remains a rare gem, a legitimate #1 center who still isn't fully appreciated. And that's what makes him so fascinating to talk about. If you think Suzuki is underrated, drop your take in the comments. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more deep dives into the NHL's most overlooked stars.